All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another wonderful edition of the Modjeska School for Human Rights. This evening, we're going to cover the heroic age, as some call it, of the civil rights movement in South Carolina. Again, as we've talked about this semester at the Modjeska School, the Palmetto State played an integral role in both the human rights and civil rights movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. And this evening, I am very pleased to welcome several guests from the Center for Civil Rights and Research at the University of South Carolina, being led, of course, by Dr. Donaldson, who has several members of this team with him this evening. So tonight, again, as is the case with all of our other classes, as we have the presentation going forward, please make sure if you have any questions to put those questions in the chat, and we'll get to them during the Q&A session after the presentation is finished. So what I'd like to do now is to have Dr. Donaldson introduce himself and his team, and then we'll go from there.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Green, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm Bobby Donaldson. I'm a professor of history here at the University of South Carolina, where I direct the Center for Civil Rights History and Research. I'm also a founding member and lead scholar for an organization called Columbia SC 63 Our Story Matters. I'm joined tonight by several of my colleagues who are part of the Civil Rights Center, including Rachel Young, who is our program coordinator, Frank Gauze, who is our outreach coordinator, and Rebecca Turnmeyer, who is our education coordinator. They will do the bulk of the speaking tonight on behalf of the Civil Rights Center. We have a PowerPoint presentation that we will bring up in just a few minutes through Rachel. But I want to say that I'm pleased to be here this evening. This guy, Brett Burst, and I have had a relationship for some time. From the beginning of the Simpkins School, I've been a part of the various presentations. And typically I do these things on my own, a solo act. But tonight, I'm very pleased to bring colleagues who carry the torch forward. I think one of the greatest assets of being a scholar is not only the scholarship we produce, the materials we accumulate, but also the young minds we produce. And so Frank, Rebecca, and Rachel are the new generation of the Civil Rights Center. So I'm very pleased to have them as part of this conversation this evening. Rachel, if you want to bring up the PowerPoint, we'll begin.
All right, give me just a second while I pull it up. Okay.
All right, so if we take it to the second slide. All right, so I've been a professor at the university 22 years. And from nearly the very beginning of the work I've done on campus, we played a very active role in cultivating and in bringing in various collections to support civil rights and African-American history. I've done that in collaboration with several colleagues on campus, including Dr. Belinda Littlefield, and we've built on the legacy of other scholars, including Dr. Grace Jordan McFadden, a pioneering oral historian in our community, and Dr. Willie Hereford. And for decades, these collections have accumulated as part of the special collections of our university. They include collections of organizations, they include collections of individuals, and they include collections that highlight milestone events in the modern freedom struggle in South Carolina and around the nation. Now, although these are robust collections, over 60 of them, not many people on campus, in fact, not many people in the community are aware of the contents of these collections. And so in the fall of 2015, we announced a new initiative on campus called the Center for Civil Rights History and Research. And this initiative was born in a conversation with Congressman James E. Clyburn. At that time, we were eager to acquire and house his congressional papers, and he was very reluctant to make that commitment. Ultimately, what we agreed to do was to form a partnership with South Carolina State, his alma mater, to share collections, to digitize collections. But at the same time, we would commit resources and individuals to build out an organization by which these collections would be used to advance teaching, to enhance research, and especially to educate and to engage the public. So those are the essential points of the Civil Rights Center's mission: to engage, to inform, and to serve. And the next slide, Rachel. One of the persons whose collections is now a part of our holdings was a woman named Donella Brown Wilson. Ms. Wilson was a longtime community leader, educator in Columbia. She lived to be 108 years old. I had the good fortune of knowing her and working with her and helping to solicit her collection, which is housed here in our libraries. And during one occasion, we were talking about these boxes of materials, these letters, these photographs, these oral interviews, and a lot of moving footage. And she was impressed by that. And then she said, well, what are you going to do with it? She said, having this stuff housed in boxes on shelves means very little unless you use it. And so Ms. Wilson has become a real point of inspiration for me to figure out how we take these items, which are properly stored by archivists in boxes, and give them life and meaning and utility. Inspired by Congressman Clyburn's directive and inspired by the words of people like Donella Brown Wilson, in 2018, the center decided that we were going to launch a major exhibit by which we would excavate, we would go through all of our various holdings, and we would put forward an exhibit. Now, I've been on the university's faculty for a long time. I thought I knew pretty well what our contents were, and I was overwhelmed by what was uncovered. We went through about 60 different collections in multiple libraries at the university's campus, and those libraries include the South Caroliniana, the South Carolina political collections, moving image research collections, our oral history collection, and our rare book collection. And from those collections, we went through the boxes, we looked through the folders, and we decided to put forward an exhibit entitled Justice for All, South Carolina and the American Civil Rights Movement. The exhibit was on display from February of 2019 to August of 2019. It attracted over 5,000 visitors, including members of the Progressive Network and members of the Modjeska School. It exceeded every expectation, and it brought in a whole diverse group of people, many of whom had never seen or had no interest in coming to the University of South Carolina. That exhibit now is traveling around the state. You'll hear more about where you can see that. There's also a digital component of the exhibit as well. And just to give you a snapshot of what was included in that exhibit, I'll have Rachel go through the next slide, which is a 1-minute video of what was on display in 2019. I don't know if the sound is on, Rachel.
You have to unmute Rachel.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
If we're not hearing the sound, that's okay. I think it's because you may have your headset on, Rachel, but that's okay. Just play it through. Let's take us to the next slide, Rachel. So, as I said, this exhibit went on until August of 2019. And in the fall of 2019, we had the regrettable task of taking every item you just saw, placing it back in a folder, back in a box, back in a climate control space. And that was a painful experience for me, kind of going through that process of closing exhibit. But fortunately, there was a move and a real effort among individuals to keep this exhibit alive. So there is now a digital exhibit that is up. We're developing a more curated digital exhibit that will be emerging very soon. There is plans to place a permanent exhibit in the historic Booker T. Washington High School, which you'll see in a moment. And right now we have a exhibit that is now traveling around the state of South Carolina that is supported by a very generous corporate gift that we'll speak about in a moment. As you see in this slide here, one of the more exciting things about the exhibit was not only did we have these important and sometimes rare documents on display, but it became a destination for so many people. There are people you see on the screen who are the children of George Elmore, who you'll hear about in a moment. Walking into the building right next to me in the second photograph is a man named Fred Gray, who in 1955 defended a woman named Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama. He comes to the exhibit and gives an opening address and speaks about what he had learned about the struggle in South Carolina. And the overwhelming number of individuals who saw the exhibit were actually children and students from districts across the state. And we're now, and Frank or Rebecca may speak about this, we're developing a number of educational components to join the traveling exhibit. So the next slide. So I speak of collections, and by the collections, I mean the various holdings we have in our libraries. And these collections, which many of which are now digitized, include the papers of John H. McCrae, a pioneering civil rights journalist. They include the papers of Modjeska Monteith Simpkins, which are digitized. They include the papers of the Reverend I. D. Quincy Newman, who was a longtime leader of the state NAACP and the first African-American elected to the General Assembly in the Senate since Reconstruction. They include the papers of Reverend Joseph A. Delane, who was a leader in the Sumter Briggs v. Elliott movement. But they also include letters and communications from a number of individuals across our state, many of which had never been seen before. And so just to show you the kind of the breadth of our process, if you look at the next slide. So we went through these collections and sometimes box by box, folder by folder, and began to decide which are the most significant or illustrative documents or items we might put on display for the public to see. And after about a 6 months process of going through these collections, making that decision, that is what led to the Justice for All exhibit that was on display for 6 months. Now, to explain what was a part of that exhibit and also what is now part of our traveling exhibit, I want to turn to Frank Goss, who is our community engagement and outreach person, to explain more about what the contents of this exhibit tell us about the history of civil rights in South Carolina. So Frank.
Thank you, Doc. If you don't mind, Rachel, would you go back to the previous slide for one moment? Good evening, everyone. I just want to pick up right where Dr. Donaldson left off. What you see here on this table are a number of items, artifacts, original documents, which becomes very valuable when you don't know whether or not there are other copies that exist. And so when we are going through the process of assuming collections from individuals that are willing to allow us to take on and utilize for educational purposes, sometimes we don't know the extent of these collections. And so it becomes a process where we have on our team an archivist who understands the best ways to actually preserve these items, but then also in the process, we look to see what really holds historical value. A lot of folks may find some of these items at their grandparents' house because older folks tend to hold on to things much longer, but they have way more value. They've seen a lot, they've experienced a lot, and in their golden years is when they're ready to actually make some contributions to give back to those so they can learn where they've been. And so what you see here, for example, you see off to the left, there is it looks like a sort of like an obituary, but it's really a program. And you see a face on it. That face is actually Thurgood Marshall. And it was a time where he actually one of the times that he came to the city of Columbia to speak, to encourage parents to send their kids to school after Brown v. Board decision in 1954. But you see lots of different types of items that we will go through and highlight through an exhibit. You can go to that next slide, please. So when thinking about putting these collections to work, we take our time and we curate exhibits for different reasons. There are many different pieces we can assemble, and they can represent various ideas or periods in history. And so here what you see in this image is an exhibit, part of the exhibit that highlighted some of the comic books that were accumulated through some of our collections. And so you see a lot of the young people, they're interested in those items. And so those are some of the things that you would also find in our collections that we actually put together in an exhibit. You go to the next slide. Not all of those books are comic books. Some of those are graphic novels. And so earlier versions of that. So the youth usually gravitate to those items, but those pieces actually help to highlight the history of events in Black history. What you see here in the center image is a part of the exhibit and how it was displayed when it was in Sumter, South Carolina. These are some of the center's banners that we've actually created to highlight different images we wanted to make certain really ring a tone whenever we're actually doing exhibits. And so the outside images are a part of a timeline that is a part of the exhibit. And so 1949, 1954, and 1963 were some pivotal years. And with those dates, we accompany text to really kind of pull out the role of South Carolina as it relates to the civil rights struggle. So in 49, you see the events of Clarendon County as it relates to Briggs v. Elliott. 1954, we get to Sarah Mae Fleming, which led to her bus desegregation case, which actually set a precedent and paved the way for the Montgomery bus boycotts case that was all about desegregating the buses in Alabama. And then in 63, you see Edwards v. South Carolina. This particular case was one where over 200 students was marching around the State House to protest segregation and were arrested, and it evolved into a court case. And it was ruled that it was unconstitutional for them to be arrested for a peaceful assembly. But that set a precedent as well. I mean, 63 was a pivotal year in civil rights. You have the March on Washington along with other events. And so here is an event that we're highlighting as it relates to South Carolina and really challenging the rule of segregation in the city. If you could go to the next slide. Some other events that are very important that we highlight through this Justice for All exhibit. On the right, you see a young lady next to a gentleman in the middle. On the right, you have Sarah Mae Fleming. In the middle, you have Dr. King, and to the right of him is of course, as expected, Ms. Modjeska Simpkins. Down at the bottom on the left, that's Isaac Woodard. He is featured as well in this exhibit. In the middle, you also see September Clark. And then the bottom right is related to the work of Mr. George Elmore as it relates to the Elmore v. Rice case that came about, which desegregated the all-white Democratic Party. Next slide, please. And this slide really highlights a lot of the youth as it relates to the movement. So what you will find in this JFA, we call it JFA, but Justice for All exhibit, are the events that really set the tone for South Carolina. And one thing that Dr. Donaldson noted is that, when this was initially established as an exhibit we had on display in 2019, it did bring a lot of folks together from different parts who normally wouldn't come together. And something else that was interesting about when they would come, many of them would see that they were captured in images that they didn't know they were a part of. And so a lot of these images, folks were seeing for the first time and seeing themselves and the work that they had done. And it really kind of brought back memories, which sets the stage for us to have conversations with them in the form of oral interviews when they can recap and recall those stories and share what that event was about. And so all of this really pulls together the opportunity for us to use this exhibit as a way to tell the story that wasn't told for so many years. And we use a lot of these primary resources because they're all primary resources as a way to inform K-12 standards.
And Frank, if I can just add one quick comment about this particular image, is part of what we were hoping for was that as these images and letters and things were on display and had more wider circulation, that would lead to more context about when these moments took place and identifications. So there's a gentleman on the screen, and depending on how large your screen is, you probably can't read it, but he's walking down Main Street near where the current Columbia Museum of Art is. And he has a sign that says segregation is all washed up. It was a photograph in the collection of John H. McCrae. We assumed it was from 1960 or 1961. It was marked unknown. But then later on display, someone said, I think that is George Hamilton. So we then had to figure out who George Hamilton was. George Hamilton was the president of the student body at Allen University in 1960 and 1961. He also later becomes the first director of the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission prior to James Clyburn. Today, he's 83 years old. He's a preacher and a funeral home director in Walterboro. We reached out to him. We sent him the photograph. He said, yep, that's me. And he told a whole story about what happened that day and the context behind it, as well as all the other people who were a part of him. So because of this outreach, that unknown is now the Reverend George Hamilton.
Absolutely. And so these exhibits that we've been able to curate and put on display for the community has allowed us the opportunity. It afforded us the chance to really gather the stories from the community and allow them to tell their story. This image in particular, for a long time, I didn't know that it had additional value and meaning for me. If you look at the image, the woman that is holding the sign, it says, "Welcome to South Carolina, land of segregation and discrimination." So a quick story about how these images and exhibits have led to opportunities for us to put things into context and to really understand what happened here in South Carolina as it relates to civil rights. I saw a recent image when it was on display for Justice for All 2019, and it was a woman by the name of Vivian Coxon. She was in a image that we had on social media. She came to see the exhibit in 2019, and she took a photograph. And so I saw that photograph, and I was like, oh, I didn't realize that she had come during 2019, and this is 2022. To make the long story short, that's her in the picture. And so she didn't recognize that she had been photographed, because this image is at the airport greeting Robert Kennedy, who was slated to speak at the University of South Carolina. And so she's holding this poster. Now, Ms. Coxon, when I worked in K-12, worked right across the hall from me in middle school. And never has she mentioned anything as it relates to some of the things that she had done to bring about social justice in our society. And so after I discovered that she was the person in the image, as well as the one that was in the current one, she gave me some background about everyone else that was in the picture, why they were there, but she didn't realize that she had been photographed. And so when we do exhibits, it does create the space for us to really identify folk who have participated in the movement in various ways, but then also now they have an opportunity to tell their story, and we get to document history that way as well.
And Frank, to build on that, I suspect someone like Brett probably does not remember every protest or demonstration he was in. She was the same way. She could not remember. In fact, she was surprised by this photograph because she had vague memories of this date. But what really prompted was not just his photograph. This photograph was taken by a state newspaper photographer. But there's also on our website video footage taken by a WIS videographer that shows maybe 30 seconds of what happened. And as Frank mentioned, she is there. She's a student at the time at Benedict College. She's joined by her classmates, including on the far right, a man some may know as Isaac Washington, who was the editor for a long time of the Black News. He was a student at the time. So she's greeting them, but until that photograph and the video appeared, this was just a vague memory stuck in the recesses of her mind. So what's been really exciting is to now see men and women in their late 70s and early 80s having a chance to capture a part of their life journey that they had long forgotten and overlooked.
Absolutely. We can go to the next slide. And I will turn it on over to Rebecca.
So, thank you, Frank. You talked through some of the major moments that our traveling exhibit and the permanent exhibit touched on. The traveling exhibit starts with this timeline, and then the panels dig deeper into it by hitting on some major themes. And one of the things that I want to point out and make sure that you're kind of thinking about as we go through these themes is that we start the exhibit and contextualize it within the Reconstruction moment in South Carolina. And this is important. Most people, when you talk to people, you say civil rights movement, and they think, 50s, 60s, maybe into the 70s, in South Carolina, it really gets kicked off in the 1940s in terms of our modern civil rights movement, but it's a much longer process. And in South Carolina, one of the states in which I think the only state that has this really radical moment of integration, both in the legislature and which you can kind of see the radical members of the South Carolina legislature, primary source image there, but also at the university. The university is integrated during the Reconstruction period. So we want to start visitors there to set them up to think about the long contours of the civil rights movement and how these things don't just spontaneously happen, but they're a constant buildup and a creation of events and people working towards equity over time here in the state. So I want to highlight a couple things. First of all is, again, the images of the radical members of the South Carolina legislature, which is one of my favorite documents to use in schools. And then the photograph below is of some students from the South Carolina Normal School. Now, and Doc, correct me if I'm wrong, but why this is one of my favorite photographs is because we think there's a woman named Celia Dial Saxon, who was a student at the South Carolina Normal School in this photograph. Now, if you're in Columbia, you have definitely heard that the University of South Carolina is going to name a building after her. But I think why I like Celia Dial Saxon so much and talk about her with students is because she has this cross-generational legacy of, after going to school, when South Carolina is integrated, she goes on to teach generation after generation of people here in Columbia. She was a teacher for such a long time. She impacted several generations of students who then went on to be teachers themselves and impact other generations of students. So this legacy is building upon itself. And we move through that as the Justice for All traveling exhibit moves through bigger themes of what we think of as the modern civil rights movement. Can we go to the next slide? So one of those things.
Rebecca, can we pause for a moment?
Yes.
I think my colleague Bernie Gallman just threw a question toward us about were they radical or revolutionary? They were all that. In fact, that was a term used, and in fact, many embraced it because they realized they were turning the state upside down and advancing new laws and new rules to transform the state of South Carolina. One of the persons that we include in the exhibit, I mean, just to show you how collections are built, we assume things just kind of show up in the archives. They don't. I mean, unless there's real intervention, they don't materialize. So we now have some of the documents of Celia Dow Saxon. And so in addition to being a teacher, she was a social studies teacher. She was a teacher who went against the assigned curriculum in South Carolina. How do we know it? We have her lesson plan books. How do we know it? We've talked to her former students. One of the persons who taught Celia Dow Saxon was a man named Richard T. Greener. There is now a big 9-foot statue honoring this icon, but no one mentions that he got fired from his job for being who he was, not only as a teacher, but also as a political figure. We now have Richard T. Greener's diploma. Why do we have it? Because a Black man on the south side of Chicago found it in an attic and knew of his value. And ultimately, I went to Chicago with our archivist to bring it back. It is now the only known diploma from this radical period at the university. And some of you who are from Columbia, when you have a moment, I invite you to go to the corner of College and Sumter Streets. And there you will see a historical marker that talks about the university being under radical rule. What does this mean? And why is that term so loaded during this time period? And I think to Dr. Gallman's question, if we look at some of the acts and decisions made by these Black officials, Black elected officials, Black civic leaders, there is no doubt in my mind that they were radical in the best sense of that term.
Well, and that leads us into another big theme that is pulled throughout, and which I'll talk about, that we highlight in the associated educational programming and outreach that we do with Justice for All, which is education. I know you all are going to be talking, I think, next week about Briggs v. Elliott and school integration, and we talk about that as well. Briggs is it's this monumental case that hasn't got the attention it deserves. And we want to make, it's in the South Carolina curriculum currently, but when students come to the exhibit and when adults come to the exhibit, often when we think about school equity and the civil rights movement, what's overlooked is the presence of students. Students make up protests in South Carolina. Students signed the Briggs petition. And it's also important to think about that in the context of, again, the larger educational equity push starting during Reconstruction. Some of the radical, in the best sense of the term, laws that were brought forth on the South Carolina books during the Reconstruction period had to do with public education. What was rolled back as soon as the 1877 overthrow of that group of people and those lawmakers is education. Schools become segregated legally. There is inequity in how they're funded, placed into the new South Carolina Constitution. So thinking about this long trajectory, and then how students and parents and teachers come together in the 1940s in South Carolina and start to legally push back against that and really fight for equity. In Clarendon County, it starts with a petition to get buses. It moves into a larger fight for integration, which brings about things like equalization schools, which Briggs gets wrapped up into Brown v. Board. You also get the integration of the University of South Carolina, which was fought for and happened thanks to Modjeska Simpkins' niece, Henri Monteith Treadwell, Dr. Treadwell, who we have materials from her as well as her James Solomon and Robert Anderson. And, when you're thinking about integration of the university, it's not like it happened and everything was hunky-dory, right? You have these 3 students who put themselves in a space that is inherently antagonistic, inherently violent, both verbally and emotionally and mentally, and they're still here working to better and make education opportunities open to all. And so this legacy of radical movement and putting yourself on the line to get better equity in South Carolina is something that stems back to the Reconstruction period. So we touch on education. You want to go to the next slide? We also touch on the Black Power movement alongside the Civil Rights movement. We talk about voting rights. We talk about student protest. Again, to show young people who are coming to the Justice for All exhibit that young people are often on the front lines. They're the ones who, just like them today, can have a voice and should have a voice. And so helping students connect with these various themes in the way that they do, but also people who were a part of the movement to come and as Frank's anecdote earlier, remember the things that they were involved in and say, hey, I was there. I can identify that person. I was part of this. So the reason we highlight Black Power here is going to talk about some of our collections that we have recently acquired as well. You see Angela Davis. I hope some of you got to come out to the Angela Davis talk. We recently got more of her, some more papers related to her, and she was able to sign some of the collections and primary sources that we have. But to remember that civil rights in South Carolina was multifaceted as it was around the nation, and there were different groups of people working in tandem with one another, as well as in different avenues in order to bring about and fight for equity in the state, as well as to roll back segregation and white supremacy.
Can I chime in 1 second there, right, Rebecca?
Go
So
for it.
just to add to one thing that Rebecca has shared, this example of a panel that is a part of the Justice for All exhibit is really featuring several events that really highlight Black Power. And so a panel like this really becomes a different type of resource to use in K-12 or for higher ed for that matter. Students can engage with what's here and then try to make sense of how to use these types of primary resources, whether it be an image that you see in the bottom left, which was at Voorhees College when the students locked themselves in. You have time period, you have an event, and you have a story. So now you can have all of that documented and be able to really kind of highlight what took place during that time period. And above that, you have a march. In the center, you have Angela Davis, which she's also featured in the top right corner. And so these types of items that we've accumulated for exhibits really kind of tell those stories that you could really sum up a lot of what can be used in K-12 as primary sources to teach specific time periods in history as it relates to civil rights.
And Frank and Rebecca, just to build on that for a moment, and part of why we are excited about this kind of collaboration with the Modjeska School and other organizations around the state is because this in and of itself becomes an educational moment. We realize these collections remain locked in these various holdings, but unless there's exposure, they mean very little. So when Angela Davis was here, and I'm glad Daniel has his background as he does, she had vague memories that her mother was involved in SNCC, the Student Southern Negro Youth Congress. But those who were there at her talk, she started looking through items we had here, where her mother's name was clearly visible. And there were parts of her mother's story that she was not too conversant with at the time. But fortunately that those items were preserved by historians and archivists well before my time, she was able to now literally touch something that had real significance to her own story. And before I forget, Ms. Jean Hammock, you asked me to get a book signed for you by Angela Davis. I just want to make sure you know is right here on my desk. So I'll make sure you get a copy of it. We'll get you a copy.
And you know, both Dr. Donaldson and Frank touch on something else that's really a big part of our work, which is not just exposing people to the collections that are hidden behind the literal walls of the university library, but also to contextualize those for people who may be far removed from that moment. Thinking of students today, oftentimes their grandparents may or may not have been aware, but their cultural context for civil rights, Black power in the state, just generally the state of South Carolina in the civil rights movement is not as robust as earlier generations. So we do a lot of work of helping them contextualize, but also draw connections between the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and today, because they're already making those connections, and we want them to contextualize those historically using primary sources like these. You can go to the next slide, Rachel. So these are some images from our first stop with the Justice for All exhibit. This is in Sumter, South Carolina, at the Sumter County Historical Museum. The goal of the traveling exhibit, which is connected to the Connected Communities grant, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is meant to take Justice for All across the state of South Carolina over the course of the next 5 years. We're currently moving through the Midlands. Our next stop, which again, I'll touch on in a moment, is going to be in Columbia, but we started in Sumter, South Carolina. And one of the gentlemen that you see, if you can turn your attention to the lower middle photograph, is Dr. Donaldson. I'm going to get this right, I hope. James T. Mccain Jr. Cool. Wanted to make sure I got it. He came out and he was a panelist for one of our community conversations, which Rachel is going to talk about. But his father, we have his father's date books from when he was a leader in the civil rights movement, particularly the interstate protests and travels. And so he talked some about that and the legacy of his father, but also visitors who came that evening could see the Mccain date books and read more about the context and see those photographs in place. And we had a good turnout for Sumter.
And Rebecca, if I could just build on that for a moment. So Mr. McCain is in his late 60s, early 70s. His father was integral to the freedom struggle, not only in South Carolina, but around the country. If you think about the Rock Hill Friendship 9, the Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, the Mississippi movement, he was a strategist and a planner behind all of that. And his son was a little boy at the time. He said, Daddy was always gone. And I never knew why he was gone. And now I'm literally holding in my hand his date books, and I'm turning page by page, and I see where he was. I didn't like it. I still don't like it that he was away, but now I know at least what he was doing during all those years of absence from our home in Sumter. And so it was quite an arresting moment to be there with him, to get a glimpse of his dad that had long eluded him growing up.
If you'll move to the next slide. So the Justice for All traveling exhibit does not exist just as an exhibit. It also, we have several components that go in with this to help with community outreach, programming, and educational outreach and programming. So the original Justice for All exhibit, as Dr. Donaldson said, was visited in majority by students, student groups who came, parents who brought their kids, students at the university who came to visit. And we want the traveling exhibit to be the same because it can move through the state of South Carolina. It can engage with communities that may not be able to take a field trip into Columbia, engage with communities that are underserved for social studies programming. And so we created, with the Justice for All traveling exhibit, a field trip guide geared towards the South Carolina state social studies standards, but could be used for school groups who come to visit the state and don't apply to our standards. And it's targeted for 4th, 5th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades, but can be used by younger, older, in the middle who come in. And that gives teachers a way to think about before, during, and after the field trip, that students can use the panels, which are quite text heavy for younger students, but they can engage with the photographs through activities built into that. There's also we have two traveling trunks that are associated with the Justice for All that follow the lesson plans of education, voting rights, and student activism. And in those trunks are tons of primary sources that made up the Justice for All exhibit, and some that didn't make it into the traveling exhibit. And it has lesson plans that are built around these primary sources to allow students and teachers to engage with the past using the documents that are in their hands, and they get to touch them, they get to look through them. For example, there's the comic book you saw, there's one entitled MLK and the Montgomery Story, and students can flip through it and see the panels and think, okay, what am I learning from this comic book that was intended for students my age? They can look through the financial reports of the state of South Carolina Education Department that say white schools are getting this much money per student, African-American schools are getting this much money per student, and they can do some math enrichment to think about, all right, what is the disparity here? And so our educational materials are intended to have students dig deeper in a way that meets their level and that enriches their curriculum throughout the year, not just during February. We also have programming that are targeted to teachers, homeschool groups, school groups, and which invite them to come and view the exhibit or take part in community conversations. If you go to the next slide. Okay, Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So another part of our Justice for All exhibit that we have traveling is our community dialogue sessions. We want to, so while we have those educational outreach programs for kids, we also want to make sure that we're connecting with adults and helping use this history to apply it to the present in people's communities. So there are so many legacies of the civil rights movement that continue today, and building on the foundations, there's a lot of people who want to do that and aren't always sure how to do it or who to connect with. So these community conversations that we've had, we worked on them in conjunction with the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission. And the idea was to do a two-part conversation event. The first one was a panel of individuals from within a community. So if you look at the lower left-hand side, you see the panelists as well as Dr. Donaldson and Commissioner of the Human Affairs Commission, Commissioner Davis. And the panelists spoke about, in Sumter, about issues that were going on in their community and the problems that they'd seen, and even some potential solutions or how they could see things go in the future. These conversations were addressed based on things we'd kind of identified from talking with people in Sumter. We shaped the discussion questions off of that, as well as connecting it to the themes in Justice for All. The second part of the conversation, the second conversation event was more of a activity-based, where we had people split up into groups and work through some questions about the community and about ways that they could see their community in Sumter connecting to this history and where they could see the legacies of the civil rights movement. And by doing that, we hope that they were able to make a lot of connections that would be able to bring, basically be able to bear fruit in the future. We're doing these kinds of conversations we hope to do them in every place that we bring the exhibit, as well as to have it available even if the exhibit in a place where an exhibit isn't even going to be. And so,
and could I add one thing there, Rachel, about those conversations? The community conversations also create a space for people in the community to really share their perspectives about what they may know about these particular events that took place during the civil rights era. Some may be much younger, but they, because South Carolina has been so segregated, many of the experiences you may find in one community, one may not know about if they live in a different community based on race. And so because segregation has, in this state, really kind of kept the lives of people separate, these conversations create a space for folks to really understand how each community has processed these events, whether or not these are events whether they've been able to experience without trauma. Most cases, some people have trauma because of the things that happen during these periods. And, it gives them an opportunity to really have some dialogue that could lead to reconciliation, it could lead to healing, but more so to really understand everyone's perspectives and stories, because that's what's going to really help to understand what took place during these different times.
Yeah, and I think that makes a really good segue into talking about the oral history project that we're also working on, also associated with Justice for All. And so I'll go ahead and move on to that next slide. Maybe, if it works. There we go. Frank, if you wanted, I don't know if you wanted to talk about this or if you wanted me to.
Sure. So along with the Justice for All exhibit, we're also conducting we're trying to create a robust oral history collection. So based on the civil rights era and folks that were involved, or if they had family members or friends, or they have a story that they could share that could really contribute to the story of civil rights in South Carolina, we seek them out to see whether or not they would be interested in telling their story. As mentioned earlier by Rebecca, Mr. James Mccain Jr., his father, was very integral in the civil rights movement. So capturing his story and how he saw the role of his father and the activism that he was unaware of, just understanding that his father wasn't there, is critical. But then over time, he has learned more about the experiences of his father and others. As you see on the screen, the process of how we go through, we do these oral interviews and we try to ensure that we create opportunities for the communities to tell their stories. They're living libraries. And so a lot of the things that they've experienced, unless you were there, you wouldn't know. And so we want to build a robust collection of oral histories so that we would have various perspectives telling about the events that have taken place in the state of South Carolina. And those oral histories can be used to inform how we teach the civil rights struggle in South Carolina at the academy as well as K-12.
Just to quickly add, so these oral histories were recorded at the Lincoln High School in Sumter, which is where some of the people we interviewed attended high school. And so just wanted to mention that because the location enabled some discussion outside of just the oral history that was also really informative.
So some of our recent programming, outreach, and training, as we've mentioned off and on, the Angela Davis lecture, which happened a couple weeks ago now, what we co-sponsored with African American Studies Department on campus. It was wonderful turnout again. That's just one of the types of lectures and events that we sponsor and we set exhibits up for. Recently, in the past month, we also assisted with the James E. Clyburn Health Equity Lecture done by the Arnold School of Public Health, which has different panels and posters, and it's a conference of sorts that discusses and thinks about reducing and eliminating health disparities in the state of South Carolina. Another one, which happened last year, the Color of Law series, which was based around the Color of Law, Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. book was a partnership between Richland Libraries, the City of Columbia. We helped sponsor it, and it was a series of 4 discussions done virtually, which talked about and explored the concepts in the book about understanding how segregation in cities and redlining shaped Columbia, and as well as to explore the ways that today we can address the effects of past policies to create a more equitable community. On the teacher education and outreach side, last year we partnered with ETV and the South Carolina Department of Education through one of their grants to create 5 virtual tours of important civil rights education sites around the state. These included Booker T. Washington High School, Florence Benson Elementary School here in Columbia, Bettis Academy, Penn School and Brick Baptist Church, Lamar High School, and Scotts Branch. And these are available online, and we can drop those in the chat. But what we did is we went with ETV and we filmed these sites, some of which are privately owned by school districts that don't allow for student groups to come visit them. And these are sites that are central to this ongoing conversation and the history of civil rights in South Carolina as it regards to education and equity. And so we filmed these, we put in historical documents inside the virtual tours. There's captions and thought questions, but associated was a virtual teachers institute that engaged 20 South Carolina teachers in learning about these sites, taking their students on these virtual field trips, and then writing lesson plans and curriculum around them. We also go into schools and have pop-up exhibits. And last summer, we helped sponsor the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute Freedom's Lawmakers, which had teachers from around the country virtually come to South Carolina and learn about Reconstruction in South Carolina and how Reconstruction lawmakers, broadly defined, really shaped the period, and why Reconstruction and teaching Reconstruction and how to teach Reconstruction in your classrooms is so important in any moment, but particularly this moment. And they created lesson plans and visual essays using a lot of the collections that we've talked about. We also, looking towards the future, want to keep having more teacher programs and institutes, and some of the other programming and outreach that we do, Frank is going to talk about.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. So yes, we do participate in a lot of community outreach events. They're through our Columbia SC63 initiative, as well as through the center. We are invited to create exhibits and display the contents of our collections. One of the more recent community outreach events that we participated in was the Harambee Festival that was at the stadium for Benedict College. We have an upcoming event, which will be at the Black Expo. So we connect with the community in multiple ways, but we try to make sure we're very visible. And as noted by Dr. Donaldson earlier, it's always an opportunity for us to learn more about some of the photographs that we have in our collections and receiving assistance and support from the community in identifying some of the folks that may be in some of those photographs.
And really quickly, before you move on, Rachel, I want to touch on the photo on the left, which is from the Lamar 50th anniversary in 2019, before the pandemic. I think it's for 2020, but the pandemic happened. But this is from the panel. And these are some of the survivors from the Lamar Bus Attack. And one of our goals and our mission and our vision, is to bring historical context to current public policy, social justice issues. And Lamar is one of those moments towards the end of what we think of as the civil rights movement in 1970, when forced integration of the South Carolina schools becomes a flashpoint. And Lamar, when hundreds of white parents created a mob and attacked the buses that were carrying students to integrate the schools. And it's a lingering trauma in that community. And we worked with the the community anniversary committee to create a panel discussion around Lamar, and we are continuing to work on and help tell community stories from community points of view. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that because that's part of our work on social justice. And
let me build on that, because I'm it's interesting sort of standing back, multitasking, and hearing everyone kind of go to the list of things that we've done. And you kind of forget, I mean, I certainly do, of the various things. And so Rebecca and Frank and Rachel have used this term community. And I want to underscore that because I think that's something that's often overlooked, certainly by the folk here on campus, about what we do. I believe that our greatest task is to take this material, which is housed here on our campus, well beyond our horseshoe, well beyond the walls of our camp, the literal walls of this campus. I mean, we are a flagship university, and I know we have tremendous resources and capacity. And part of what we do, and Frank and others can talk, I mean, we're on the road all the time into every corner of this state, making sure this history is told in classrooms, museums, in libraries, and very often not many people on campus know that that is happening. If you go back to that photograph you just showed of Lamar one more time. So in our collection, we have the moving video footage of a man named Gerald Best, a self-announced bigot who helped engineer the riot against these Black children on buses in Lamar in Darlington County. We have video footage of the NAACP leadership who challenged segregation in the schools. We have interviews of journalists and highway patrolmen, but we never had any direct memories of the Black children on those buses. So these three gentlemen who are in their late 60s, for the very first time right before the pandemic, they agreed, some reluctantly, to tell their story about what they witnessed, what they endured as those buses were being overturned in 1970. And so I think that's yet another important contribution of the work we're doing, that not only are we uncovering history, but we're giving historical figures a platform and a portal by which they can tell their own story. And I think that's a tremendous asset of the work that this team is doing.
And that feeds into how we go about, uncovering that history and telling those stories and allowing historical figures who have been overlooked to bring their stories and their experiences to the fore. And that goes through collections development. We're not just traveling the state to do programming, we're traveling the state to actively collect papers and books and yearbooks and photographs and VHSs from people who want to make sure that those collections and those stories and their communities are housed somewhere that can make sure that it's conserved and then brought to the public. For example, with Angela Davis, and I think the one up, I can't talk to the one on the left, but earlier in the year, last year, I guess it was last year, we were driving up to Greenville to a woman wanted us to be looking through her collections, and we started collecting from hers, and it was from her house, and we went there and she was helping us work through boxes and boxes and boxes of things. I mean, boxes. And
well, let's call her name, because Brett knows who she is. Efia Iwangaza. Efia, she has a tremendous collection that she knows has tremendous value for an educational and research purpose. She knows she's advancing in age. She knows unless she plays a role in the intervention, it could be lost. And she told us she had a lot of stuff. I've not been to her home or office, but she has more than a lot of stuff. And we're now trying to make sure we have the resources, the time to make sure we can do all we can to help her preserve her legacy. So that's just one example. That photograph in the top left, Frank can tell the story. That we went to a storage unit to look at material of a man named John Stevenson. Who is John Stevenson? The first African-American superintendent of Richland District 1 schools. He was a historian in his own right. When his family sold their home, they put everything in storage. And in that storage unit is tremendous amount of material about local school district, about Allen University, about the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, about Laston Presbyterian Church, about his own educational career at Columbia University, about his career in the military. And so eventually, after many months, when that collection has been properly cataloged, it will, I think, be of a tremendous value to teachers and students.
Go to the next slide, Rachel. So some of our ongoing work, as Frank mentioned, Columbia 63, and he'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. We give walking tours of parts of Columbia, particularly Main Street, as part of Columbia 63, to student groups, families, whoever comes and wants to take the walking tour and schedule it. Another important thing, which we've all touched on and Dr. Donaldson said really well, is telling community stories. Community stories are often the ones that are most overlooked by the public. We think national, we think state. And community stories can often be hard to tell because memory plays into it, people moving, people coming back, the movement of people. But yet you talk to folks in different communities and we all want to think that people are going to hear our stories, and we help folks do that. And we'll talk about Ward 1 is one of the groups that we have worked with in the past and continue to work with, telling the story of Wheeler Hill, of which both Ward 1 and Wheeler Hill are the victims of university expansion and mid 20th century urban revitalization. Some of those come into social justice conversations. Telling community stories is an inherent in social justice conversations today, and knowing the past of those communities is important for understanding the current moment in which they live, as well as support and sponsorship of student-led initiatives. We have tons and tons more that we could talk about. I do want to make one of upcoming things, just a note before we take questions. So if Rachel, you could go to the upcoming event slide, please. Yes. So in this summer, starting in June, we're kicking off a new engagement with teacher professional development with Florence District 3 teachers. I think we'll have about 15 plus the superintendent who we will be working with to talk about how do you incorporate South Carolina African-American history throughout the year in their curriculum, and we're going to be working with building that in. We'll also be launching our Story Matters podcast in, I think, this month. We'll be attending the Black Expo in Columbia later this month. Look out for the Reconstruction documentary, which focuses on Randolph Cemetery here in Columbia, as well as a Reconstruction website associated with our National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute last year. We have a Briggs v. Elliott website, which will have tell the story of Briggs v. Elliott, as well as highlight primary sources that folks might not have encountered before on that website. And recently, the University of South Carolina, as well as the Center for Civil Rights History and Research, was listed on the African American Civil Rights Network, which is a part of the National Park Service. And that's a big deal because we can now work with them on talking more about South Carolina civil rights. And upcoming is the Randolph Cemetery anniversary. So we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience, and we're happy to touch on anything else. Again, we could keep going.
Well, thank you so much for that. This is, again, a lot of great information, and I hope if you haven't had a chance to see their exhibit, whether in Columbia or traveling, please make sure you do so when you have a chance. And there's already a question in the chat from Jean Hammock. She asked, do you have a program that will help families make some of these discoveries on their own?
Well, currently, and Dr. Donaldson, I could please correct me, we do not have a program specifically for that, but that I know of, but you can reach out, and we have definitely helped folks do that before. That might be something we look into. I'm not sure. Dr. Donaldson. You're muted.
So sometimes the Civil Rights Center in Columbia 63 is like a fast food, place your order, and we'll deliver for you. And we've done that. And so we've done workshops for churches about how to preserve their records and cultivate records. We're working now with the Delta Sigma Theta sorority on preserving their own records. I've done numerous family reunions and genealogical presentations about how to go about just the very basic steps of doing one's family tree and also preserving records. We have a workshop about how to preserve family papers and photographs and memorabilia. And so it really depends on what the requests are. And if we have the staff and the availability, we're very glad to be of assistance.
Okay, another question in the chat is the Center for Civil Rights History, a Briggs v. Elliott website, going to lift up James F. Burns' work to ensure the famous Supreme Court ruling known around the world was Brown v. Board and not Briggs v. Elliott?
We have been looking for that smoking gun for a while. So there's an ongoing debate as to why we know Brown and not Briggs. And some have argued that James Burns plays a direct role. Some have argued that the NAACP played a role in sort of which case to privilege. I'm not sure if we're going to resolve that particular issue, but the degree to which James Burns sought to circumvent Brown is a part of that documentary project. In fact, a part of what you'll see is not only the work of the NAACP and the local families in Clarendon County, but you'll also see the pronounced opposition. You will see a lot of records about the White Citizens Council. You'll see a lot of records about the local school board and the arguments they made to circumvent Brown v. Board 1 and 2. And you'll also see the testimonies of people who were involved in the Briggs litigation. For example, many of you know of the famous work of social scientists in the arguments made about Brown v. Board, particularly the case of Kenneth Clark, a pioneering child psychologist, and the degree to which Clark argued that segregation created an inferiority complex among Black students. And that was a compelling argument in the hearings in Briggs and later in Brown. But what you'll see on the website is the actual findings in his own handwriting of Kenneth Clark, including the testimonies of young students from Clarendon County. And what you'll see when they do the famous doll test is that not every Black child picked the white doll. And there are some very striking and compelling cases that suggest that Clark's findings that we assume to be the case are in some ways misleading. That there were students who did not believe that their segregated school system was inferior, and they had no inferiority complex. And there is one woman whose name is Celestine Parson, who we brought to campus a few years ago, who contradicted Clark completely and how she saw herself, her school, and the school system. So the hope is that when this exhibit, this website is available, you're going to see a multi-dimensional perspective about Briggs v. Elliott and the Brown decision.
That's very fascinating. Well, we like more questions to come in. I do have a question for the folks who are involved with the Center for Civil Rights History, which is, what's the most surprising item or document or photograph you've come across in the archives, whether at U of SC or throughout the state in your travels?
I mean, recently, I'm working on the Briggs website and a National Register nomination for Scott's Branch, and I was trying to look for and confirm which churches in Somerton had mass meetings, which again is a conversation in the community. And I found, I mean, it's been digitized, so it's not like it's a discovery, but the FBI document about Joseph DeLange and his request for the FBI to investigate some of the violence and targeting that he was receiving, and how the FBI would make notes and just kind of write it off and be like, oh, a local officer's looking at that. And this is a 70-page document that has information about the mass meetings. They're clearly watching it. But the fact that this clear example of white supremacy and white violence because of, community action against, trying to attack, dismantle that system. And the FBI just kind of writes it off, but they still keep a large file. So reading that was interesting to me. And as an educator, I was like, God, I can't wait to take this to students. Because we often, sometimes textbooks will hit on FBI observation of civil rights leaders. But when you think about other people who are trying to engage the FBI to get them to look into these instances of violence, that opens up bigger questions for students. And so that was probably the one that I have seen recently that was just like, oh, this is excellent. Not excellent, but it was a cool find.
Right. Yes, that is a cool find. And I have two that are connected. The first, to add some context, I was one of the teachers that participated in the Teachers Institute that was sponsored by the Civil Rights Center. It was its inaugural Teacher Institute in 2017. And so Dr. Donaldson facilitated this institute. And during this week-long institute, there were collections that had been brought in. The contents Doc was somewhat familiar with, but he wasn't, he knew what was in there, but we didn't know. And so in one of those boxes was an original copy of Dr. King's Nobel Peace Prize speech. And so in going through that, I actually was able to be photographed holding an original copy of his speech. The other was a ticket that noted that Malcolm X was scheduled to speak at the Township Auditorium April 17, 1963. Now, interestingly, what Dr. Donaldson did when we did this institute was that he took this small ticket stub and he blew it up to about this size. So it was like maybe like 6 inches by 12, something of that nature, but you could see it visibly. So the impact that it had, because now it was this huge artifact, it just gave me so many different ideas as to how I would, at the time, because I was still in the classroom, how I would use that to teach my students about 1963. A lot of teachers, they're looking for something that's a hook that could really just spark conversation. And to give them that, many students are unaware that Malcolm X had been to Columbia. And I said there was 3. The third is there is a picture, because he never spoke at the township. His contract to speak there was canceled, but he did receive an invitation to speak at a church that was on the other side of Benedict. And so the third thing was there was a picture. We have a picture in one of the collections of a woman holding a child. And in the background, there is a flyer on a church door that states that Malcolm X will be speaking at this church on this day. And so just those original primary sources that we've been able to uncover, those artifacts have been very like, oh, wow, this is huge. And so these are the stories that we hope to be able to communicate through our collections.
And if you don't believe Malcolm X came to Columbia, just ask the FBI. We have that report too, that documents exactly what he said. And on exhibit, in our original exhibit, we actually have an article from the Clemson College Tiger newspaper, where there's an extensive commentary about what occurred and the pronounced opposition to Malcolm X, not just by white leadership, but by Reverend Ida Quincy Newman and the NAACP. So that collection that Frank mentioned that came in was a collection purchased at auction by a woman named Marion Bruce Logan, who was a gifted singer and a financial champion of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That collection that Frank and other teachers unwrapped that day is now fully digitized. And you will see in that collection the Nobel Peace Prize speech. You will see checks signed by Jackie Robinson. You will see autographed books by James Baldwin. And you will see the list of the persons Dr. King took with him to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And on that list is a woman named Septima Poinsett Clark, who taught here in Columbia for many years, who was also quite active in the movement in Charleston, as well as elsewhere around the country. Some other items, Dr. Green, just to mention that were surprising to me was we knew about the Friendship Nine, or the Rock Hill Nine. And there is on our website video footage from February of 1961, when those students were put in 30 days in a chain gang in Rock Hill in York County. And there's video footage of students from around the country coming to Rock Hill to champion their colleagues in prison. It is footage largely unknown. We recognize certain adult figures, but also in that footage is a young John Lewis, footage that he had never seen before, and a visit he did not remember when we talked to him about it. He thought the very first time he came to Rock Hill was during the Freedom Rise when he was beaten, when in fact he had been here months earlier. Also on exhibit, I think it's somewhere on exhibit, is a letter from jail by a man named Tom Gaither. It's a 4-page letter, handwritten, that we did not know existed, that we just found in the collection of a woman named in the South Carolina Human Affairs, Human Relations work. It was just filed chronologically. And when you go to February 23rd, 1961, Tom Gaither writes a letter from jail explaining why he and his colleagues refused to accept bail money so that they could dramatize the conditions of Black people in the Jim Crow South. So those are just a few examples. But every day is a new discovery. Just what Frank helped me 2 weeks ago, we brought in boxes of stuff from Cleveland Cellars. It includes planning documents from this event you may have heard of called the March on Washington. It includes a letter from Dr. King to Ramsey Clark calling for an investigation of police brutality in the Orangeburg Massacre of 1968. So the list goes on about what is being uncovered as this work goes forward.
I also, for me, I'm not from South Carolina. And so working for the center has given me a crash course in a lot of South Carolina history. And it's not a surprising archival find, but it was a surprising place find. And I think one of the things that we forget when we're talking about history is that places are documents in a lot of ways in and of themselves. They're landscapes, they're places where people lived, communities thrived. And for me, it was Bettis Academy. And if you've never been to Bettis Academy, it's up near Aiken. We did a virtual tour there. And when I read more about it and learned the history of Bettis and how it was founded by Reverend Alexander Bettis, who was a formerly enslaved man, and it was a private institution for a long time. And he founded it because he said he saw that public education in South Carolina post Reconstruction was not meeting what he thought the needs were of good education and training for teachers, ministers, midwives, nurses. And so out of this school becomes a community institution where people were born and where they died, where they lived, where you have the 4th of July celebration. So that was a surprising find for me because I had heard a lot about Rosenwald schools. I had heard a lot about segregated public schools here. I had not heard a lot about private institutions, and Bettis was one of those. And so if you get a chance and you're up in the Aiken area, there's a museum there. That's really fantastic.
Rebecca, don't we have a website where that material?
We do. I'm going to drop it in a minute, the virtual tours.
Yeah, so we have that. And also on campus, there are the papers of Voorhees. There are the papers of Mather Academy in Camden. That's buried in the papers of John Ware Harper II. We have papers from Bettis Academy, papers from Harbison Junior College or Harbison Institute. So a lot of those historical educational facilities are here as well. And really quickly, a collection we're working toward is the collection of a man named Frederick Calhoun James, who was very active in the civil rights movement in Sumter and later in Columbia. He just turned 100 years old about 3 weeks ago. And we put up a display honoring him at Allen University. And I spoke to him yesterday, and he asked if I could take him to Bettis Academy. He said, I want to go there before I leave here. And he explained why. He said in Bettis Academy in the late 30s, that is when he was taught Negro history. For the first time, someone intervened to take the Mary Oliphant Sims book to the side and to challenge what was in that received narrative. And so if we can make it happen, we'll take the 100-year-old to Bettis Academy so he can see those grounds one more time.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. And I think that's actually a natural lead into an important question from Alan Sattler about how can we get the traveling exhibit to come to Lancaster County?
Okay, Rachel, you heard that?
This question, I can take this question. So if you are interested in it coming to your community and there's a library or museum or community center that has space, then definitely get in touch with us. You can go through our website. We have somewhere on there's a link where you can have an institution apply to host Justice for All, or you can send us an email. Our email is also on the website for more information on it. So that's probably the main ways to do it. So we are definitely.
And I'll say too, to Rachel's point, ideally, when we first envisioned the traveling exhibit, we first thought we would just simply take a moving van and leave the exhibit there. We know we definitely need a local institution as a partner. But one of the things we learned when we had the exhibit here on campus is just having a static exhibit is okay, but unless you have robust programming and activities around it, you're not going to get the attention and foot traffic. So ideally, you also want to partner with an organization that can devise engaged programming that would bring a community group, individuals to a site to see the exhibit.
And if you have kids, if you have grandkids, if you have any contacts within the school system, homeschool groups, youth groups at your church, 4-H clubs, and you want to get kids involved, we have education and kids programs that goes along with Justice for All, and I highly suggest bringing your kids there. It'll be at King Park here in Columbia over the summer. So there's an opportunity to come in and participate in the programming and see Justice for All at historic King Park here in town.
And again, that was intentional. We knew that having these exhibits in long-standing institutions, libraries, museums, means we're only capturing a certain segment of the community. I know for certain that when we have that exhibit, King Park is going to bring in a whole different group of individuals who now remember, King Park is what, 4 blocks from the university. There are people who would never walk up Green Street here, but who would definitely take advantage of the information there. And Rachel, we also have commitments now to take the exhibit to Georgetown. And I think we're going to Dr. Gallman's hometown of Hartsville some point next spring. Is that right?
I believe that Hartsville is actually going to be January through March of next year.
Okay.
Georgetown, I want to say that'll be at the end of 2023.
All right, there's another interesting question in chat from Donna Jones. I'm curious about the community conversations that have happened and whether any of those have led to continuing conversations in those communities.
So far we've only done it in Sumter. There had already been some conversations going on there from what I've understood from talking with some of the people who attended. I don't know how much conversation occurred after that, but I do know that some of the people who were there hadn't really interacted with each other before and were able to give each other their contact information, like a couple of organizations that people came from different organizations and were able to get in touch with each other if they hadn't before. So even, I don't know if there are continuing conversations, but at least there are those abilities to continue having conversations if they want to do so. And I know there was also an interest in setting up, I think it's the Human Relations Council with this Human Affairs Commission. So that was a thing that the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission also wanted to make sure was available if people who attended the conversation events wanted to continue this kind of conversation and even do some work on it.
I'll say these conversations are difficult, and Sumter was a hard nut to crack, in my opinion, just getting a diverse group of people to be in attendance. Several people came out and said, I haven't seen you since summer of 2020. And there was a huge gap of conversations. And I'm glad Marjorie Hammock is here because I have a confession. We often, these educators go out and we want to have these conversations and we're ill-equipped. We actually are, which is why we work with the Human Affairs Commission. Because I think when we bring these conversations, which are pivoted around the exhibits, we need therapists, we need social workers, we need a lot of people at the table to really help shape the conversation and to lead people through further conversation. We come in, we bring our equipment, we bring MCs, and we go back to Columbia. But you definitely need to have people on the ground who can continue these conversations. I must say that in Sumter, those conversations do continue. And I've been in dialogue with some of the leaders there. In fact, I think I'll be going back at the latter part of May to continue a conversation we began in February. But again, it's one that I think requires a lot more gifted people to help shape those conversations than simply academicians. The other thing I'll say too quickly, that was a frustration in Sumter, which is, I see it all the time. The question is always, well, Dr. Donaldson or anyone else, what can we do to get more young people in the conversation? And I'm like, I don't know. I wish I knew the answer to that. That's always a difficult task. To convince younger minds that this is a conversation, this is a conversation worth having, and you're the audience we should be having it with. I think that's also the other big challenge going ahead. We realize that when we do programming going in the future, we should do programming that is geared directly toward younger audiences, and to see how the conversation will be different in that capacity.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I can tell you that interacting with students at Claflin and elsewhere, there's definitely a hunger amongst younger folks to have these conversations, but I think they also want to know that the conversations will lead to something. And so it's kind of painful for them, but I hear from students all the time they want to talk more about these issues as well. Are there any additional questions? I will say, just slightly off topic, I'll be reaching out to the Center for Civil Rights Research as well, because I know that in Orangeburg later this year, we'll be having a traveling Smithsonian exhibit called Voices and Votes. So I want to reach out to you guys about potential collaboration there. Because as we all know, Orangeburg
is that the Library of Congress? Is that the Library of Congress exhibit?
It's actually, from what I understand, it's with the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's coming to our location in late October. It's already traveling around the state right now.
We're doing programming there in April this summer.
Yeah. Well, aren't we working with Aiken a little bit on this one thing?
That's right. Yeah,
Someone just asked a difficult question, Professor Green, and I was hoping we go the 2 hours and it's not coming up. It says, if critical race theory is banned in South Carolina schools, how would that affect your exhibits and center's work? I don't know, and I don't care. I teach civil rights history. I don't teach critical race theory. I don't know what Frank and Rebecca and Rachel believe, but until the moving van comes to this office, we'll keep doing what we're doing.
Since I work in schools, I know teachers have been worried about this since last summer. But what we told them last summer was the same thing that we'll keep telling them, is that using primary sources, you can't call those untruths because they're from the past and they were created by people. And the best thing to do is use primary sources, and we work in primary sources. And if primary sources make you uncomfortable, sorry, watch TV. I don't know what to tell you. But that's the basis of history, right? Is looking at what people have produced, and what people have produced in the past are multifaceted and not pretty. And civil rights history is not critical race theory. It's civil rights history. I don't know. I hope teachers continue to come to us and use our primary sources.
And I think I'll add to that. As both Rebecca and Dr. Donaldson have noted, we just teach the history. This is what happened. I mean, we're not teaching stories, we're teaching actual accounts. And to add to that, South Carolina has a law that requires schools to teach, public schools to teach Black history in the classroom. And it has been on the books since the late 80s, like 1989. And so whether or not this is happening, that's a different story. But there has been a law that's been passed that states that Black history needs to be taught in schools. And so what we provide is the content so that it can be taught in the schools through our exhibits.
It's a slippery slope too. So Rebecca mentioned Briggs v. Elliott, and Rebecca used the example that, if we provide the appropriations for white schools and Black schools from 1945 to 1955, and you then engage students to say, you do the mathematical formulations to see the inequities, you'll notice that in a state like Florida, if we do that in a textbook, it's now banned. It could be banned. And so it really opens the door, just how far do we want to go as we put education on the chopping block for political purposes? And that's essentially what we're doing.
Dr. Green, this may be an appropriate time for me to make a pitch for the Progressive Network and the Modjeska School. The appreciation that I have for Dr. Donaldson's work and the fact that it's getting legs and support and spreading. Our work as the Progressive Network and the Modjeska School, as revolutionaries, up front, stone cold, want to overthrow the type of systemic racism that this state and this nation was founded on, takes it a bit further than you're able to without going to jail with us. But that you warm the waters for us, and we warm the waters for you. And God bless all of you. Thank you so much.
That's a great message for us to all remember. Are there any additional questions? And by the way, Dr. Donaldson, I will inform you that my department chair, Catherine Silva, says hello. Just texted me to tell you hello. So just letting you know that. Any additional questions? Again, this is a great resource we have right here in South Carolina.
I would just like to make an idealistic statement. Even though people call me cynical and so forth, I tend to have a streak of idealism. This was a wonderful presentation and very enlightening. And I heard reference to several other programs. I think that in some way, rather than a loose cooperation, I think that perhaps some thought should be given to the possibility of creating another organization comprised of the organizations that are teaching true history. And that way there can be a spirit of cooperation and maybe even a plan to disseminate the information even greater. So I just want to put that out there. If anyone wants to do that, I'll be glad to participate in that creation. I think that that there needs to be cooperation other than just casual. I think that we need to be very deliberate in our planning so that we can have an aggressive offensive as well as defensive stature, because our reaction to critical race theory is purely defensive, and we need to formulate some offense in order to fight that. So I just wanted to put that out there. I yield.
Marjorie's trying to say something, but she's muted. No, she's not. She's shaking her head.
No, I think Dr. Gallman is certainly onto something there. And I would certainly be all on board for what Dr. Gallman's referring to, both greater collaboration, because I do have to say, both in my capacity as the lead instructor for the Justice School and as the professor of history at Claflin, I feel a special sense of urgency in trying to make sure that folks are aware not only of the rich history of civil rights in South Carolina, but more importantly, of understanding how history is actually done in the first place. I think when we introduce to folks these ideas that you guys have talked about this evening in terms of using primary sources, understanding there are so many stories still waiting to be told from folks living in the state, I think it demystifies some of this for people. It helps them understand that they themselves are part of this larger historical tapestry of life and culture in South Carolina that I think is really important for all of us to understand.
Yeah.
Okay, and Mr. Hall has the question, besides exhibits, are you working with ETV to share the stories?
Yes. We work closely with ETV on several projects. With the tours, the virtual tours, they're hosted on their knowitall.org platform, which is open source, widely accessible to anyone who goes. If you click the link that I put in the chat a while back, you can view any and all of the tours. They're tagged so that parents, teachers, students, the public who are searching for particular terms like civil rights, Briggs, Bettis, Aiken, these will come up as options for them to look and dig deeper into. So those are those resources. You know, we work with ETV on several other projects. I think they were a partner on our podcast that'll be premiering in May, and will definitely be a partner coming in the future. So we work with them off and on a bunch of different things.
If I got paid every time my mother saw me on ETV, I could retire really soon. So we do, and ETV is a very important partner. In fact, we just eked out a deal with them that by spring of 2023, we'll have a new documentary about a civil rights protest at the State House that led to a case called Edwards versus South Carolina. So we'll be in production this fall, developing that 30-minute documentary that should air in March of 2023. And that will feature lawyers and students who were involved in a protest on the grounds of the State House on March 2nd of 1961.
Dr. Donaldson, if you lift up during that, the fact that Edwards VSC ruling has opened the door for free speech for 60 years now. That was the precedent for the Grove v. Campbell case in '84, and the occupiers.
That's right.
On the front lawn of Occupy versus Haley in 2011.
Right.
So thank you, Edwards plaintiffs.
And there's there is now a marker and a monument on the corner of corner of Gervais and Main that chronicles the 188 individuals who were arrested and convicted during that case.
There's another brief question to chat from Donna Jones, who asked, could you say more about what your podcast will be focusing on?
Yes. So each episode, and Dr. Donaldson, you'll have to hop in here on some of this. Each episode focuses on different aspects of the civil rights movement. I know and it interviews different people, including, Dr. Donaldson interviews folks who are a part of various movements and protests, as well as some of the major themes that Justice for All hits on, like public demonstrations, public segregation, voting rights, white backlash, education. I'm not sure if there's a specific one or a specific interview that you want to highlight, Doc.
Well, it will be, it's kind of an overview of the larger exhibit, but you'll hear firsthand accounts from a woman named Dee Dee Wright, who was one of the student organizers of the Edwards v. South Carolina protest. You will hear from children of those who were part of the Briggs v. Elliott lawsuit. I think next week you are talking to Millicent Brown. One of the people who's in an upcoming podcast will be Miss Ovita Glover, who was among that group of students in Charleston who desegregated schools in 1963. We also have Professor Randall Kennedy at Harvard University talking about the significance of several landmark cases out of South Carolina that went from here to the Supreme Court.
Definitely looking forward to that podcast. That should be a great one. Another question from Greg Howell. I think this is really interesting. If you had an unlimited budget, what else would you do to advance your center's mission?
We're having a meeting about that tomorrow. Seriously. So we've been very successful in getting a number of corporate gifts, institutional support, and we're working on another major grant. And we're trying now to dream beyond what we've told you. What more could be done? To Professor Dr. Gallman's point, what are those collaborations? And also, to what degree do we use our resources and skills here to support other organizations in South Carolina and across the region? And so there's this ideal now that the center will not just work on the work we do here, but it will be a hub, in that we will use resources to support programming, outreach, and research in other parts of the state and other parts of the region. So stay attuned. It is to be continued, I think, and we'll see where we go from there. I'll let Frank and Rachel and Rebecca, they get all my midnight emails about what I want us to be, so they can tell you what I've been saying in my midnight missives.
Well, I think one of the things, we're constantly looking at new ways to engage with folks. And, someone brought up the question of getting younger folks to the table. And some of that is engaging younger folks where they're at, which is online, and is looking into virtual reality. We've gone to several things in which maybe we're looking at being able to bring Edwards v. South Carolina or some of the public protests into the realm of virtual reality, where folks can hear the sounds around them as they move through the space of Main Street or as they move around the State House. I think that's, it's a way in which we can engage the public and get them to think about also communities and buildings and structures and landscapes that are no longer here for a variety of reasons throughout South Carolina. Particularly, I think a lot about Ward 1 and Wheeler Hill. There are parts of Wheeler Hill that you can see if you know what to look for. There are not those of Ward 1. There's now Strom Gym over, for example, a historic school there that was central to the community before Florence Benson was built. And being able to reconstruct that in the virtual realm, where people can then juxtapose what they see today with what was there in the past, I think can bring people and think more critically about the documents and the people in place, because as humans, we're very place-based. So for me, that's one of the things I think we can and should look towards in the future, as well as using oral histories to allow people to speak in their own words, either through documentary or through having an archivist in a backpack program where kids and students and community members can record their own stories through archival training, and allowing the next generation to learn those skills so that they can become historians in their own right.
And also having the resources and the money to pay people, to compensate people to tell their stories. We were very mindful. I mean, for a long time, we'll give an honorarium, a big one to Angela Davis and Cornel West. But what do you provide the three gentlemen who were on that bus in Lamar? And so if I had all the resources, it would be to provide appropriate compensation for those people to permit us to even listen to them, tell their stories.
Yep.
That's a really important point. Now, to that, Joseph Tolliver has a question. What were the reasons for establishing the private schools Bettis and Mather Academy? How were they funded?
Well, Bettis was established near Trenton, between Aiken and Edgefield. And I think Rebecca mentioned it was done by Reverend Alexander Bettis. And he created the school to compensate for the lack of any adequate public schools in that community. Later, a school called Schofield emerges in closer to Aiken, or it exists near Aiken. But in Trenton, there were no schools. And much of that was funded largely by Black Baptists. Later, the American Missionary Baptist Association provides some funding, the same organization that gives money to Benedict College. The other school, Mather Academy in Camden, was also funded largely through Northern philanthropic support through the Methodist Church, in addition to support from the local communities. Another important question is really why those schools folded. And many of those schools find their closure not too far off the Brown v. Board. Harbison Institute, many of us know Harbison as a mall, as a neighborhood, but don't really know there was a thriving school in that area. And that school closes in the mid-1950s as a direct result of the desegregation of schools in the region. Many of these schools lived on a hope and a prayer during that time period. And when you look at some of the papers which are housed here now, you see it was an ongoing effort to solicit support and funding from private organizations and from philanthropists around the country. But you also see where those young men and women, they raise money on their own. They traveled, they performed, whatever it took to bring those resources, they did just that.
Was the Mather in Beaufort different than the one you just referenced?
The Mather in Beaufort was a Baptist school.
Joe Neal went there in the 60s.
He did. And I think the Mather records from Beaufort are at Benedict, and the Mather records from Camden are actually housed at Claflin.
I think this is a really interesting question. This will be our last one if we don't have enough time to get to the one after it. But this is from Don Murphy. Are you tracking or documenting what young people in South Carolina are currently doing in regards to civil rights?
No, and it's episodic. I think, again, unless there's something kind of that rises to the headlines, there is certainly no one here actively doing that, and we should be. There was a small initiative to do an oral history project that we just played a small role in doing the summer of 2020 and thereafter. And so there are very short oral interviews of people who are out front in those efforts. I think the Caroliniana, our colleagues here, may also have a small manuscript collection about what happened then. But to that question's point, we need active field archivists today, not simply capturing what happened in 1960, but what happened yesterday. And also to that point, being able to have the resources and platforms to capture history in ways that we are not terribly equipped to do so. So when we talk about born digital, When we talk about social media, how do you archive that? How do you preserve that for the future? And that's a real task for us. So the question to that point about if we had all the money in the world, I think we would definitely have to invest in making sure we capture the coverage of activism in on platforms and in spaces where we're not really trained to do so today. But there are places that do that quite well.
And one quick final question. Has your organization done any collaboration with the South Carolina State Museum?
Yes. We've done a couple of exhibits there. We've had things from their inventory as a part of our work. In the work we do at Columbia 63, a very close partner of ours is Historic Columbia, Experience Columbia, nearly every historically Black college in the state we work with. We have very strong partnerships now with the State Archives, with the South Carolina African American Heritage Commission, and with the Cecil Williams Museum in Orangeburg. I think, Brett, this group, a group through Modjeska School has maybe had a virtual tour of Mr. Williams, but we're also working with him now to properly inventory and archive his very impressive collection.
2 Sundays from now, Cecil Williams is going to narrate the beginning and end of the Scar Justice film about the Orangeburg Massacre that he was there taking pictures of. And that will be a Sunday activity that everyone is welcome to, and I'll share it with you, Dr. Donaldson. You can share it with your peeps.
This is the documentary on Scar Justice?
The Scar Justice film,
Okay.
It's been out for a while, but
Yeah.
not
Okay.
everybody's seen it. That's part of what we do here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, everyone give the team a round of applause. Again, I want to thank Dr. Donaldson and Rebecca and Frank and Rachel for doing a great job in presenting what the center does and how important, how integral the center is to life here in South Carolina today. Brett, any final thoughts?
To echo your appreciation, I just think that I've considered for a long time Bobby Donaldson like a hidden gift to South Carolina and the nation, and he's not hidden anymore. And I'm so thrilled, and he's passing on his energy to a younger generation, which is quite admirable. And thank you, Dr. Donaldson, and all you folks, Rebecca and Rachel and Frank. The Modjeska School is like, we bought a building and we're going to be here for a while because the struggle continues. And towards that end, we're going to adjourn here, but it always seems there's some people that have something else to say. And so I'll hang out for a little while, everybody else can leave, and I'll chat. We'll turn the recording off and we can get in the weeds. So thank you all for coming, and we'll hopefully see some of you soon.